Hi everyone, I'm Jordash. Tonight I'm going to be talking about sort of the history and development of the rest of the industry, like the toxicological industry, and how it you can see it in the background there, and I'm going to bring that up. So basically, what we're talking about here is just sort of like where the chemicals come from and where are we going to go with them, and then sort of how after these development cycles sort of complete themselves, what does that whole landscape actually sort of look like from at least this perspective? Each individual company may or may not have the sort of the big historical picture involved with it, or sometimes they do, and that's sort of like their internal history, basically. So basically, what I have on the screen here, I don't know where I found this image. It was just sort of like Googled, and it was appropriate, and it became something that was descriptive. So I don't know where I got it from. It's just there, but it makes sense. It tells a narrative from basically how things really sort of developed in the last sort of century. So if you kind of get into any type of university coursework, you usually end up with like a little prehistory, pre-industrial revolution. Basically, it's herb-based type of. So pharmaceuticals has this sort of like herb-based um, prehistory where tinctures and tonics and poultices are kind of the mainstay of just medicine. There's no sort of real east and west divide. There's surgeries, but they're kind of few and far between, and you know, death is common. So up until the industrial revolution, where some of these different chemicals start getting refined and well spread enough outside of very specific, I guess I'll call it, they're like really specific how do I want to say that, enclaves, we'll call them enclaves or something like that, where it's like there aren't so many people having the information sort of extend beyond the stuff. Like everybody knows how to like treat wounds and stuff, but the sort of the cutting edge is still kind of not so much guess, but they're really flying blind because there isn't enough analytical sort of uh, developments to be able to really um, really industrialize it. So basically, by the late, I'm gonna put this in the 1800s ish. So like 1875 ish, the ability, like the globalized, like the world gains the ability to basically be able to refine and purify chemicals to somewhat of an analytical standard where you can get that like 90% plus purity. It's not technical grade, and it's not ores, and they're not still plant derived you know, liquids, tincture. It moves out of the potion phase of medicine and kind of more into, no, you need 10 grams of this with 5 grams of this with this. You have your recipes, but it really kind of gives you this increase in control over what exactly are these molecules kind of doing and capable of. And this is sort of where atomic theory kind of starts coming into play into the medicine, into the sciences. Um, so around the turn of the 19th century, so like 1900-ish, all of that is already just sort of set in stone, and you're getting into radiative therapies and stuff like that. So for the most part, although it's not widely adopted and it's not really heavily industrialized, national players to be able to have and know these types of standards. Basically, you get some standards developed, and that was a big push for pharmaceuticals, where 10 grams of this refined substance will always produce this type of result with this body weight of person, kind of thing. It's no longer, go find me. It's no longer go find me herbs in the wilds and hope that the active ingredient in the herb is at a sufficient level enough to be able to, treat the disease, kind of thing. It's a little bit, it's a lot more refined. So basically, what kind of happens after that is the war breaks out. So the industrialization of chemicals, basically. I always freeze up on that kind of thing because I like to think on my feet more often than not. But basically, the industrialization of chemicals kind of reaches this point where they can be sort of used in the First World War, kind of thing, and that's where chemicals were sort of weaponized at that point. They were industrialized and then they were sort of weaponized with the First World War and the mustard gases. So that kind of set the stage of like, okay, well, their application was terrible, but the fact that these chemicals can be made in extremely large scale quantities really started to kind of like really enter into people's minds what this chemical world can really do, and in terms of medicine, the world just experienced sort of the advent of like what pasteurization is, and that cells can cause disease, and that these little microbe cells can, cause disease, and they're present in food, and they're present in spoiled food, and they cause spoiled food, and then they cause you to get disease, and it I'm going to use the rye example. I might be wrong with this one, but it's like rye and wheat will get a mold on it, and then if you eat the mold or you bake it into bread and stuff, the mold created a lysergic acid, and the bread that the people would eat would be laced with LSD, basically, which is sort of not, good, but this era and period from like 1875 to like almost 1930, 1940 kind of thing, really kind of squares off. We know about stuff that is too small to see. We have a better atomic model. We gain an atomic model. We understand what atoms can do. We have electrons and neutrons and protons. We know what life is made out of. We got a whole bunch of really nitty-gritty fine detail out of this era for the basic big chunks of, what makes the world, basically. It still doesn't solve like the Disneyland type of problems, but a lot of the Disney World problems got solved really fast in this era. So basically, at sort of the I'm gonna fit this into the. I'm not a historian, so somebody's gonna bark up the wrong tree on that one. But basically, take this with a grain of salt. So somewhere in your 1910s to 40s kind of thing, you're able to make industrial bulk chemicals, and that's where this image comes in. So in the first sort of big growth period, chemicals are made in bulk. It's no longer just specific formulariums. I'll call them like, your medicinal chemist kind of thing, like your pharmacists making stuff in small batches. You now kind of get like, oh, if everybody's using this amount, we can, we found a process, and a lot of it was being able to find the process that would allow for large scale volumes, and that is its own discipline. But basically, chemicals are able to be produced in bulk in this period. The next kind of thing, and the chemicals I'm talking about are small molecules. They are, I'm going to use TNT as an example, but I'm thinking more Haber process on this. Nitrogen was able to be, detached from a natural source, and then it creates this like big agricultural boom because you get this nitrogen application fertilizer that is able to sort of like restore barren fields and stuff like that. So it's sort of like this like flourishing of like miracle times kind of thing around the world. The next thing is, so these like simple molecule chemicals sort of get like made in bulk, but then the next step is, okay, well, the larger, more complex molecules, like in this instance, the picture here is depicting dyes and specialty chemicals. So that really frees up, and I'm going to use arsenic as an example here, where it's no longer are you reliant on arsenic as a green colorant and get that type of structure chemical, that the intensity of that dye from an actual carbon and hydrogen molecule. You can start creating these types of color bearing pigmentation at sort of like cheap consumer quantities. That sets up another pollution problem, because that's basically the textile industry. That they're their own problem with that one. But being able to synthesize large quantities of small molecules and complicated molecules puts you into the late 40s, to the mid 40s basically, where you're starting to get into drugs, patent drugs. This is sort of when it really kind of becomes its own era. It flourishes. You get a lot of pesticides being created. Herbicides, insecticides. A lot of this is that 1940. This is the real boom. This is the real sort of like baby boom here, where not only are everything cheap and easy, but this nitrogen fertilizer process is still kind of rejuvenating the world still. And the war is over, and everybody can be fed now, because the 20s and the 30s are kind of over with. That environmental portion isn't really I want to say it's there, but it's not the cause kind of thing. But what I'm getting into is basically through the late 40s into the 50s to 60s, and at the beginning of the 70s. This is sort of when DNA comes out, and this structure-specific, basically the enzyme theory of structure and function kind of gets developed in this time period, and the drugs of this period are, and the molecules of this period are really sort of, there's no safety controls on it, like there's no FDA yet. some of the chemicals find an application, but there really isn't an awareness of long-term consequences in this time period. It's you know, here's a weight loss pill that decouples oxidative phosphorylation. You know, you're guaranteed to lose the weight, but if you don't drink enough water, or if the dose is too high, you kind of, spontaneously combust. That was one of the. You don't actually catch on fire, but your body temperature overheats because that heat energy isn't being, captured. So you're burning the fat, but it's just like it's too much. It's too much. Then you have the big sort of example that is taught in the schools is the thalidomide example, where here's this great chemical for treating for treating morning sickness during pregnancy. Unfortunately, because it wasn't really tested, it ended up creating birth defects in the it stops blood vessels from forming in the fetus, and so limbs are stunted. And that's, if you Google thalidomide babies, there's a big sort of 60s, 50s, 50s and 60s era call for better drug regulation or molecule regulation. And at this time, it's sort of like this is sort of where I'm gonna call it the post-war boom of this type of industrial discovery, this military industrial discovery of these chemicals and what they can do, and searching really gets like hammered down to the point where it's like, no, this stuff has to start being tested against the biology of the environment, the biology of the people, because this is where the FDA and the EPA get created in this around 1975, because of what is going on from basically 1935 through almost 1970. So there's a huge that in and of itself of the industrial considerations of why the EPA and the FDA were created in the first place is incredibly important to realize, because it's not that all chemicals are bad. It's that era after the war required such an undertaking to sort of develop everything and rebuild everything that the consequences of these actions were never actually thought of. Plus, in the 50s there was Korean, and in the 70s there was a Vietnam War. So those types of applications from like an industrial sort of supplier end perspective really sort of shape the world of what America looks like and why America does what it does and how America acts, thinks, and behaves. Particularly with regards to this is what happened within your grandparents' time, let alone your parents and yourself time. So this is where somebody like myself growing up and hearing stories from their grandparents versus looking to the future and what has to happen for my children, for my future kind of thing. their decision, my grandparents' generation and the ones that preceded them, capacity for long-term decision making is almost not there from like a political zeitgeist almost. The prevailing winds of that generation don't apply anymore today. It swung so far the other way because nobody wants another world war. So that kind of leaves us in the 1975. And in 1975, with the EPA and the FDA kind of coming on board, saying, okay, you at least have to do like some rigorous toxicity testing for every new molecule. So it's like there's a condition, there's a set of stuff, there's a set of rules that basically say here's a generally considered as safe. It was the grandfather clause from congratulations, your molecule got away with a mass distribution. It was something like Tylenol. There was testing beforehand. Don't get me wrong. There was testing. However, the FDA kind of at this time point required term and more diversified types of tests that were required to allow a molecule to be sold to the general public. And that's what really boils down to. It boils down to the sale to the general public and how this is going to go. Is the molecule, these molecules have a very specific purpose. And if you don't have that purpose, you're not getting sold to. That's sort of like your over-the-counter, prescription-only type of divide. And then there's the research divide, where you're basically free to make any chemical you want and test it. But whether or not it goes to pharmacy or finds a practical use, those types of molecules end up on the shop floor, kind of, so to speak. Like, they just get cut and they never see the light of day again. So basically, in the 70s, the new toxicity testing of the FDA and the EPA and the pharmacological testing sort of open up the world for, okay, well, now you have to start doing this whole body absorption, distribution, metabolism, these types of studies, which really opens up the whole body, and this prevails into the 90s. And it still prevails today. It's still mandatory today. I'll get to that in a second, but basically from the 70s, from like 75 to like sort of 95-ish, or at least the early 90s, there's the whole body gets mapped in terms of major pharmaceutical systems. And this means that basically major classifications of chemicals with respect to everything that had a hunch on it basically gets confirmed in incredible detail during this period. So you have receptor molecule interactions. So your hormones get really well mapped by both in terms of their biochemistry in the sort of in the wild type case, which is basically me not having a better word for what your body does naturally. So those metabolic pathways get mapped out, and then in there, like, here's the molecule to the next step in synthesis. Here's the enzyme and the cofactors that regenerate the enzyme in this time period. So all of this sort of gets mapped in the 70s. Then from that point, your major classes of molecules that are intended for environmental or human or veterinary applications, they also get mapped at the same time, because you did the hard work setting up the body plan and the environmental plan. What happens after that is we're going to use one molecule and we're going to screw up this one thing, and that's how it works. And you get a result. But then you get a piece of the picture of that result. So stuff I'm talking about. Actually, there's a picture I can show for this. And also change the music at the same time. Put in tame. Yay! Where are we going with this? No, this is not the one I wanted. So basically, it's sort of like, even in the case of this, because I have it available, I'm going to switch this over here. So, there, this one to that one. Okay, so what's on the screen right now is the how one of the molecules, this drug molecule cyclophosphamide, gets metabolized, and how it gets metabolized by which enzyme isoform. The majority of this work is done in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, and this is basically where sort of toxicology proper gets established and starts becoming the University and National Institute of Health sort of backbone for all the medical schools. They'll kind of go into this sort of like, not even the medical schools. I'm not going to speak on that because it's still, this type of information doesn't really affect the medical schools. It affects the drug developers that then provide the information to the doctors so that they can make better informed decisions. But here's a molecule in the corner here, cyclophosphamide. It gets metabolized by two different enzymes in two different P450 enzymes in two different families. There's more, but these are the two main ones. And this map starts getting developed of how there's many different, even though the shape is the same and the enzyme behaves the same basic function, the shape of the enzyme and the structure function can create two different products. And then how those two different products go on to be continually metabolized before they are eventually excreted, or they react with a body part, a cellular, there's a cellular interaction involved with it. So then that this just sort of brings us back to what's happening in this time frame here. So that's when biopharma and antibodies and a lot of the tools that are developed for the COVID vaccine are coming from this era. So these are like in the 90s, the shift is kind of into like knockout. So basically between AIDS and AIDS HIV outbreak in the 80s, and a lot of the work required for developing the Human Genome project, it goes from high-end biochem, structure, function, and metabolic pathways to genetics with knockout mice capability. So that's how kind of like healthcare and begins to shift. Because there's just so many people, and it's a globally collective effort that just sort of exhausts data. The world just eats data points. It just spits out data points. It's not that difficult to change a cell or a molecule and then create another whole paper out of it. That's how big these industries got. Everything can be manufactured. So that kind of brings us into 90s into 2000s, where there are gene knockout mice. That's what I wanted to do. The knockout mice there are basically, there's a gene, and the gene can be silenced or the gene can be removed, and then tested for drug approvals or drug interactions. There's a couple of different mechanisms to do it. Basically, it's like the gene is no longer functioning in this individual animal, and they're done from birth. So it's done at the embryo phase, or the fertilization step phase, and then this animal grows up without this gene or protein being ever expressed within it. And that gives a better understanding. It's a control group tool to be able to understand and know what that one enzyme does for people or for the animal. So it's like if I knock out a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or one of the genes for cystic fibrosis in a mouse model, how did that affect its metabolism of this drug? Because you still don't really want to give that drug to a person yet if you don't know, specifically if you're really trying to treat a specific cause of a disease, and that's what they're used for. It's not willy-nilly. It's sort of, here is an animal, a transgenic animal, or something like that expresses disease in people. And that's really sort of the emphasis there, where it's like, no. The power there is amazing. To be able to say, this does this, yes or no. And that's incredibly important. And that's kind of like that's the National Institute of Health level of development of medicine and stuff. So that's sort of where I'm coming into my own interest in pharmaceuticals. But from the 90s and 2000s, the shift and the development of technologies pretty much develops, and there are companies out there that sell knockout mice. There's companies out there that have immune compromised mice to be able to answer questions with. What kind of happens in the 90s, or after the 90s? So all of this sort of reimagining of life comes to the forefront, and the Human Genome Project kind of gets initiated, and you're getting into the proliferation of genetic type of tools, essentially culminating in CRISPR, gets developed. So this is where 23andMe kind of comes into play here, where it's like, no, the price, what used to be extremely expensive at the national level, has collapsed down within 20 to 25 years and is now, reasonably affordable for households. That are part of an industrialized nation. And the price keeps dropping. So that's kind of really incredible. But those are the limitations of genetics, and what the big push in genetics during that 95 to 2010 kind of taught us was that um, while some diseases are one, here's one gene and here's one base pair, and if we can just fix that one base pair, um, the disease goes away kind of thing. Um, it's a lot more complicated than that. And it hasn't, and the real hope here is that, like, oh, well, if we just know more, and this is where big data is just crunching all these numbers and stuff like that, but that's not how it works. It's it's really kind of epigenetically driven at the individual level to sort of correct this type of stuff, because the epigenetics control this. So here's your DNA, and then you have silencing regions on top of that, and you have methylation events that dictate which sectors of the genome get expressed and how frequently they get expressed and how much they get expressed, and sort of essentially why. That's the sector that makes you you. And it was sort of encroached upon in 2010 to 2005, and it hasn't really hit its legs yet. It's still kind of it's like when you plant a seed and you see that first sapling kind of come out of the ground. It's still in that seed and dormancy stage. It's not a dormant stage, it's still in that sapling stage, where it's like, okay, we know how all of this other stuff works, but being able to selectively silence and selectively express without actually modifying DNA or protein expression through the epigenetics, that should be just about ready in 2025. That's where that's sort of the cell, gene, and immunotherapy. So we have, if you notice on the TV, if you notice on the like Wheel of Fortune, you get all of your immunotherapies, your monoclonal antibodies, and your immune inhibitors, your MABs, your inhibs, and your ipilimumabs, and blah 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 blah. Right. So all of those drug names are, coming to market from all of the work done during HIV/AIDS, and how a lot of the immune work done in that time on how to solve how to solve a retroviral virus problem and make a medication for it, really just kind of like cuts the tangent of our timeline here, and now makes it to the forefront in this conversation. So that is important, because there became oncological applications for all of this immune system stuff, and that's kind of what we're seeing now in 2020. In 2010 and in around 2005, it was just in a lot of that, in terms of oncology, was well, in terms of it too. You didn't get PrEP until like 2010ish, give or take, or even some of the other antiretrovirals. So this immune therapy wave of development is kind of coming to a head right about now, and COVID and the mRNA vaccines is really a completion of about 30 years worth of work for a lot of people. So they're all about ready to retire, and they set up their companies and they're moving it through. And the next big ones are epigenetics, and the question is, can you get regenerative medicine? The short answer is yes, but it's extremely personal, in the sense that it's like if you go back to the bulk chemicals side of it, where it's like The chemical is exact. If I buy 100 grams of 100% pure chemical X, it is the same all the time. Forget the people. It's the people. It's like forget the people. The hardest part was getting the drug to that purity, and now it's sort of really the pendulum kind of swung the other way, where it's like, okay, we have to approach this at the per individual basis. And that part is difficult because you need the infrastructure to be able to do the genetics. You need to do the metabolism. You need to be able to know and understand. So it's like you get your blood test done. But there's a whole industry that goes from, the time the phlebotomist, takes the vial out of their little machine there, or their little socket, and gets that to the lab, and then there's an auto sampler, and then there's stuff to do the sample processing with. That also got built up in the last. Well, that's always sort of existed. It's really been sort of proliferated because there is such a need for that sort of like baseline information. There's a ton of need for baseline information before you actually get sick and go to the hospital. Because if you get sick and go to the hospital and you have this baseline, your doctor doesn't really sort of guess anymore. They have they'll have a really good idea of more information is better information, and information is getting cheaper regarding your biology. You can add in genetics on top of that, and you can add in, you really get a full profile of who you are as a person, as a historical artifact of the time you're living in, kind of thing. You can use ancestry.com, and you can see, you can plot your diseases, you can plot your health, you can plot your, it's not, it's information. It's about disease prevention. And if you have a disease, it's about having the power to be able to understand how to take action, with your doctor, of course. But, a lot of people I've spoken with a quirk. We'll call them quirks because they have personalities. These people have personalities, and they're good personalities. I love their personalities. They're hyper specialized. It's like you want to give them a medical degree, just for what they have to learn. Just there's some people that they want to learn it, and they would probably cure their own disease. Then there's people who are just sort of like whatever. They allow themselves to get hit by the bus or thrown under the bus rather than building it. There's just that two different types. There's two different types of people in the world, kind of thing. Try and be the person who builds the bus. Might get a job for it too. Hey, who knows? But anyway, so after all the gene and immunology is kind of coming to a head right now. Regenerative medicine is kind of, how do you get like limbs to grow back? How do you make wound healing faster? So a lot of this kind of, and tissue engineering, this goes into, some organs can't regenerate. I like the liver because it's pretty, it's robust, it can regrow, it's designed to be able, like, a portion of it is designed to just die and regrow and regenerate. What I'm talking about there is how the liver actually is segmented, and the older liver cells increase their capacity to create The older the liver cell is, the more it has a propensity to metabolize more with P450 and oxidase. So it generates basically more reactive oxygen species, and then sloughs off, and then you know it ends up in the feces. The cell itself apoptoses, and that ends up in the feces, and it goes away, kind of thing. It goes into the blood, and then gets destroyed that way. But it's on a continuous sort of like growing and sloughing kind of cycle. In terms of burns, this is where your tissue engineering comes in. Can you do better burn recovery and recuperation? Can you regrow limbs? That's sort of like the whole Sticker and Dr. Sticker's inspiration there. You can regrow a limb. You can regrow a tail. I can't talk about this really, but I like the idea of the lizard rather than the starfish, because Dr. Stickers was a gecko lizard, Madagascar day gecko. I picked up at the pet store, just to sort of just study and just watch that phenomenon happen. He died of a calcium deficiency, but that's a whole other story. It was cool. It was really cool watching it grow back, and just even watching it, it's like it grows like a plant. The tail grows back like a plant. It has this little sort of like meristem, but the meristem is like it's growing. It grows its bone first, kind of thing, and then just sort of like does that elongation. It's really actually pretty kind of freaky looking when it first happens, but it's pretty. What had happened was a bunch of birds scared him, and I had the windows open and were playing with them, but a flock of starlings came and started freaking him out, so he just twitched it off. By the time I got him into his tube to calm him down, it had already gone black with necrosis, so it just like popped off. So anyway, he was cool. He could walk on windows and ceilings, and he was fun. Anyway, so the portions in the pink boxes at the top there, the surgery, you get, if you follow just the capacity of surgeries and surgical instruments from like 1875 to 2020, remote access surgical robots is where we're at, kind of thing. Surgery is a surgery, but the level of you can do microscopic remote surgeries at this point. It has incredibly finesse is a nice word if you're looking from a technological standpoint. It's its own thing. I want to stick a battery in a pencil and pop a bunch of tumors. Okay, that's sort of like, let's find a company and do that. That's the goal here. But where it goes after, and that's sort of where I'm looking here on these pink boxes at the top here, the epigenetics and microbiome therapies. Microbiome kind of flagged everybody in like 2000, in the late 2000s. That's the ecosystem of gut flora and how that, oh god, and proteomics is thrown in here too someplace, but just thrown in there. Eyes are rolling in the back of someone's head right now. But the microbiome therapies, and I brought this up in another Twitch one, would be something like, if you get a probiotic, if you can put for lactose intolerance, the really big one would be to put a lactase enzyme in a probiotic, so that people, when like an Activia yogurt or something, so that when they eat the yogurt, the bacteria that populates their gut aids in the digestion of lactose. So you're not tied to a lactase pill. You eat the yogurt, and the bacteria that, it just lives inside you anyway, then digests lactose for you. Like really simple stuff like that, because there are probiotics and prebiotics and fecal transplants that are therapies designed around the microbiome. That's a dirty job for, remember that guy from Mike Rowe or whatever? There's a dirty job for you. Fecal transplanter. So there's that type of stuff that, like, if you're in school now, if you're like in your third or fourth year, get into that now, because it would be, otherwise you have to get into the next one. You can either do behavioral stuff, and that's sociology, and cell phones kind of beat everyone to that one. That's where cell phones shine in terms of medicine. Is like, can you get cell phones to reinforce certain behaviors that are going to help someone do better, even if it's something as sinister as periodic or timed notifications, randomly, to just focus away from either heavy drug use into the phone, or play the app instead of doing the drug. Like there's stuff like that, but that's anyway, that's whatever. But anyway, if you don't like epigenetics and microbiome therapies, those will get exhausted pretty fast. There's a good link between obese, the microflora of obese people versus the microflora of non-obese people, and how it relates to weight loss, and how that species relates to weight loss. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's in there. And South Park did that poo one with the football guy there or whatever. I can't remember. I know the name. I think it's Manning. Anyway. Yeah, so there's a whole episode where they're like, everybody's trying to like get his poo for the microbiome or something like that, for the fecal transplants. It proves a point. It was good. It proved a point. But what I want to get into is recycled and reused drugs, because that's kind of where I'm at right now, where it's like, congratulations, for the last like century and a half, everybody has been working to develop these research laboratories, these chemical synthesis laboratories, these industrial creation supply lines. A lot of stuff in the research area is really made to order, and there are whole corporations now that are specifically designed for made to order batch synthesis. But there are a lot of compounds and there are a lot of molecules that have already gone through all of this FDA and regulatory processes and health screenings, and they're approved for use in people. So they're approved for use, not even in terms of the formulations. It's just like the general molecule is approved. We don't, and the formulation, but the molecule itself has been approved. So you can put a formulation around the molecule, kind of thing. What happens there is basically that's just putting your horse to pasture, basically. It's like, you've done all the work, find another use for it. And that's where the big sort of like, can you get a recycled, they're like off-label kind of uses, but if you can get your off-label approved, that is like a huge, like, that's a whole new market. That's innovative potential. That's innovative potential with cyclophosphamide, and innovative potential with acetaminophen. It's like, can you get something that's like that is used, distributed, that has a globalized supply chain with globalized supply chain management, and production and shipping and distribution. Like the war is won in terms of that one molecule, right? It's in people, and it's been in people for 100 years. So there is all of that distribution, supply line management. There's corporations of corporations of corporations of corporations, all supporting this molecule's existence in you. It's so much easier to just find a new use for this than it is to reinvent another molecule, which would take another, whole additional set of, you need a supply line to get your raw starting chemicals in to make a new molecule. Then you need a new facility to do it, a new factory in which to synthesize it. Then you need, you need a whole other company, and then there's a whole other round of competition. It's so much easier to take something off the shelf in the hospital itself and then apply it. That's recycled and reused drugs. There is another name for it. It's not orphan drugs. It's something else. But that's you're gonna find a lot of stuff, particularly if you jump back to the 30s and 40s. There was a lot of chemical structure proliferation at that time, that if you reassess it with the last 50, almost 70 to 100 years, you're going to find a whole bunch of number one winners and low-hanging fruit here. And then going past that, so once all molecules have been completely digitized, for lack of a better word, all the experiments are done and everything's exhausted. There's always the investigation of better treatment modalities. So one of the things that was hinted upon as treatment modalities being a fertile investigative ground is the use of metronomic dosing during chemotherapy. So instead of you just getting a massive bolus dose, having less is more, but more frequently kind of thing. A day at the beach. I'd rather have 100 waves hit the beach than one big one, right? That's really sort of the gist of it right there, where it's just no, if you can get 6-week intervals instead of 12-week intervals, everything is better and more tolerated, particularly with intravenous administration. That knowledge kind of works against it. It works against me in the sense that big bolus doses aren't really liked. That's the maturity of it. It's not liked, but when you have not a lot of time to sort of wash the large tumors, that really is kind of that kind of really is your only option. It gets worse, but anyway, it gets better, but it gets worse. Anyway, how the drugs are applied becomes more important to be able to find new and better solutions. So a lot of this has to do with kind of ties into the simple bulk chemicals. So for common drugs, you might not be appropriate for a 50 milligram dose. It might be too much. So part of the better treatment modalities is to start prescribing at 25 milligrams. to start lower, and if that's not enough, take more. And this is as the physician speaking kind of here kind of thing. Like, get your own doctor, talk to them about this, talk to them about tolerances, talk to them about formulations. Certain pharmacists can do different formulations for you, but what I'm speaking about here and right now is basically for tolerability dosages, and to provide better quality of life. And better quality of life just kind of really screams at this treatment modality section. Less is more. So instead of prescribing the 100 milligram right off the bat, a 50 milligram to start, particularly with the body composition of elderly, because they're kind of in their own little world right now. There's geriatrics is its own specialty, and from the readings that I've been doing and sort of just interacting, a lot of times some drugs are they're overpowering. A lot of the elderly are not physically active, or if they are physically active, their body composition lends more to a semi-obese or state where there's extra fat deposition, which means, the body composition plays a role a little bit. So a little bit less is more, unless it's an emergency kind of thing. So if this is your regular everyday pill that you're taking, when you first start something like that, and then this is what I'm speaking of in terms of just starting someone out, start them lower rather than, having to cut them back, because you make a problem when you start higher. Whereas they haven't started a prescription yet. So start them slow and start them low. And if it's not effective enough, then you have some place to go. You can always increase. It's a lot harder to decrease a dose, and then you're just like, oh no, this was too much, so we have to drop it back. So there's a lot that goes into the formulation to make everything specific for the individual person and patient. And that's the physician, that's the doctor level that makes it specific for the person. That's why on that Wheel of Health Literacy, there's 2 times where you have to have a physician relationship, and I don't know what the other one was. Yeah, so there's physician relationship and physician examination. So the physician plays a huge role in this, and particularly with my own experiences with my own elderly family members. They're not patients, they're my family members. But from what I've seen with them, that less is more. And if you've been on a prescription drug for 10 years, talk to your doctor about just a reassessment. Because they have to, or just because you went for a blood test doesn't mean you went for this specific blood test. People's bodies and metabolisms change as they get older, and a decade is kind of a long time. So that's sort of where better treatment modalities kind of come in, because it's basically a while back in back in the day, whenever it was, the standard became a 60 kilogram person, but that's sort of the de facto. But we know that his medications have to be used, and I'm being careful what I say here, because it's the dose versus the volume of, if I'm a 6 foot, so if I take an over the counter pain medication, it's 500 milligrams per tablet. That 500 milligrams in a 6 foot tall, football player guy, he's 210, 6 foot tall, 210, versus gets one amount of drug. they get the same amount of drug, but it dissolves. So it's the same as me putting a drop of food coloring in a drop of water versus a bucket of water or a swimming pool. It's like 500 milligrams in a 6-foot person, 200 pounds is not the same as 500 milligrams in a 4'9" woman. But they both just took the same amount of drug. So chances are the 5', 200-pound person is underdosed, whereas the 5-foot woman is almost over. Like it's not a toxic overdose, but she doesn't need that much. Maybe 300 milligrams would be perfect for her. But that's really hard when you just have to make a chemical, because there's just that many people. So it's just sort of kind of be mindful about what you yourself need. And everybody kind of knows this anyway. Everybody finds their nice little sweet spots that they, for me, it's 2 500 milligram Advil to get rid of a headache or a migraine when I feel it coming on. That's usually from screens and dehydration or whatever, but that's kind of the whatever. And then there's curative devices, and curative devices leads me into sort of where innovative potential doing. And the curative devices are harder because they're usually organ supplements or something. And that kind of goes into pacemakers, and they get into these types of you can go anywhere with a curative device, from exoskeletons to pacemakers to artificial dialysis machines to heart and lung machines to liver machines to that sort of the braces or curative devices kind of thing. And that kind of takes me to the next slide I want to finish up with, where it's basically here's how it just sort of looks. So if you saturate everything, this is what it sort of looked like. The healthcare system is kind of divided into surgeries, behaviors, devices, and pharmaceuticals. Surgeries are kind of straightforward. If it's a surgery, it's a surgery. Everybody knows what a surgery is. If you need a surgery for a procedure to correct an ACL tear, then it's a surgery to do an ACL tear. If you need a surgery for, behaviors are into the healing products. I guess I'll call them healing products, but behaviors are more of if there is substance addiction, or if there is depressive issues, or if there is, they're pretty much more psychologically oriented, because that's what they are. Not all improvements are necessarily pharmaceutical. Some of them can be behavioral. I'm gonna talk about more about it, but I'm gonna touch on other stuff. So devices, in terms of healthcare, there are glasses. This is a type of medical device to be able to see better, or do my job longer, or work better effectively. Braces are a type of medical device, particularly if there is severe misalignments like cross jaw or whatever. Orthotics kind of falls into devices. It's an object. Devices are more of an object. And pharmaceuticals are pharmaceuticals. So within pharmaceuticals, there's your chemicals. So chemotherapy or chemicals. So if you take a pill for it, there you go. Microbiome therapy is I classify it as a type of pharmaceutical because you can grow and culture microbiome microflora and then inject and, well, stick it up your ass. But no, that's one way of doing it. But you can also have your probiotics and your prebiotics, and even that lactose intolerant one. That is a possibility. Whether people are not accepted at the marketplace, that's something else. But then there's cellular therapy within pharmaceuticals. So what's kind of going on here is, hi there. If you have any questions, just kind of pop up. But this is sort of what I'm chatting about. So the cellular therapy kind of stuff is if you do, I'm more along the lines of cellular implants or the mRNA vaccine today. That is the, to me, that's a type of cellular therapy because it is using cellular machinery to do or accomplish something. It's not an implant and it's not a chemical. It's a vaccine. So vaccines are a type of cellular therapy in essence. And then that leads into sort of like, well, what's a pharmaceutical implant? So pharmaceutical implants and device-assisted pharmacy, they're two things that are split, kind of pushing the ideologies of what those products are away from each other. So with pharmaceutical implants, that's something like if you have so in chemotherapy, they could be like, no, I want brachytherapy for that one. So for pharmaceutical implants, it would be something like having a radioactive seed or pellet implanted directly into a tumor for long-term care and maintenance of benign prostatic hyperplasia. It's a radioactive, but there are time release type of products available that have a time release, that they're implanted under the skin and they have a time release associated with them, and they release a chemical compound. So that's sort of what that is. But they're not actual implants like, breast implants would be an implant, or more like a hip implant or hip surgery, where there'd be a stint put in, and then implants become their own thing, but they're a surgery that can also have a pharmaceutical associated with them. So that's why I wanted to split pharmaceutical implants from actual implants, where it's just like it could just be a titanium screw that they put into you to keep a bone from fracturing, versus the heart stent, which has a time release pharmaceutical associated with it. That's why they're split, and they straddle this sort of in between zone of like, how do you get a handle on all of this stuff? Versus device assisted pharmacy. So device assisted pharmacy is more for like your glucose blood monitors. It's a device that gives you a biometric feedback that then you can take action with your insulin shots to, there's a device and then there's your insulin. Do you need your insulin now? Do you need this pharmaceutical now or later? And that's what the device does. The device helps you with dosing regimens and stuff like that. And then that goes into corrective devices. So what a corrective the corrective device may not have a pharmaceutical component to it. Actually, I'll rephrase it. Device assisted pharmacy is more like your inhaler, and the corrective devices are your glucose monitors, where they're there to help you monitor a situation and eventually correct it. Well, the glucose monitor isn't actual like correcting anything. It's there to give you an idea, and that kind of pushes us into the analytical. So technically, the glucose monitor is purely an analytical device. It's not doing anything. It's not interacting with your body's blood glucose. It's just measuring it. And in terms of the healthcare, like that's its own division of stuff. So these are like sensors and monitors with the analytical stuff. Um, Cosmetic devices are braces. Um, they're not like this. They don't have to be essential to life, but they do have a service and function. They can be something like crutches to help repair bones or they can be corrective devices would be more like varicose, like stockings for varicose veins or stuff like that. It's a tool, it's a device, it's a piece of clothing that goes over to help control blood flow in the legs. So like that's kind of what we're. It's a device that's what you ideally want to have insured protection over, I guess. Um, but down in therapeutic devices in the bottom blue corner there, um, a therapeutic device would be something like a trying to think of one off the top of my head, but it's I'm kind of lost in the music right now. So anyway, therapeutic devices would be um, glasses. Glasses are the better. Yeah. So if we got to go through that list again, therapeutic devices are glasses. They kind of are involved in a behavior. I'm sitting, I'm working, I'm doing stuff, but it's also a tool. It's a physical object. Um, Rather, the corrective lens, not the style and the shape of the frame, but the actual corrective lens. Um, so inhalers for device-assisted pharmacy. Um, Corrective devices would be like those. They have back braces and support halters kind of thing. That would be a corrective device. An analytical device would be a glucose monitor. A cosmetic device would be something like tooth braces, or something that is going to bring something into alignment. It could be a cast as well, particularly if there's a deformity where something would be broken and then realigned kind of thing. That's more surgery oriented and rehabilitation, but there are just purely cosmetic devices. Um, but there are a whole suite. I don't really go into the psychology of it, but there's a whole suite of chemical dependency behaviors that are available. Um, Cognitive behavioral therapy. Kind of fits in. It kind of fits in this. So there's a lot of psychological tools available in the behavior sector. So social supports. So if there are social supports is a big one because it really kind of gets into making sure people have food. That's a huge one in terms of healthcare, particularly children. and particularly pregnant mothers. That's a big one for social supports. And then there's behavioral dependency. So it could be something like No Fap November, as sort of crass as it's an effective behavioral dependency that has kind of made it into semi internet meme type of things where people do the Seinfeld challenge to become masters of their own domain kind of thing. Seinfeld's still kind of funny. But there are also other behavioral dependencies as well, where it's just like if you consistently have if you're having an alcoholic beverage every day at the same time of the day, you kind of get into these chemical and behavioral dependencies. Are you doing it are you just having if it's a beer a day every day after work? It's not necessarily destructive, but it's just one of those things where it's just like, are you doing it out of just straight up habit? And it's just getting these sort of like rut-based habits and just shaking them up. Don't have the beer that day, have something different. Go do something different. Are you having the beer because there's no, is it a behavioral dependency? Just go home after work and have the beer. Or is it a chemical dependency and you need to have the beer to do the other stuff? So it's a way of just sort of like, these are tools that are available in a properly functioning healthcare system that's able to actually break up stuff that, nobody's perfect and everybody ends up with a blind spot kind of thing. And this kind of really exposes the areas that the general public may or may not have a knowledge or awareness of, that these products actually exist. So then that goes into, and this leads us into rehabilitation. And rehabilitation proper is more of like, if you need to go to a rehab clinic, this is a behavioral, and it's kind of like, I have it next to surgery, because rehab is more chemical dependency. Rehabilitation, what I'm getting in here is relearning actually how to, if you're in a car accident or something like that and you have to have a surgery, and then you have to sort of relearn through physical therapy. Rehabilitation as physical therapy is what is intended here, to be able to like regain your strength and regain everything, basically, or as much as possible. Then surgeries, like, well, there are corrective surgeries, there are transplants and implants. There's more stuff, but like there are more in betweens that are unsaid, but these are the main welcome to healthcare 101 kind of thing. Corrective surgeries kind of speak from themselves. LASIK surgery would be incorporated into the eyesight one would be would be considered a corrective surgery. If you have a deviated septum in your nose, that's a corrective surgery. You smash your thumb in a door and it never got set properly, and the doctor has to reset it. That's a corrective surgery. And then transplants. Transplants are the big ones where you just pop. They're gonna hate me, but it's like you pop an organ out and you swap it and you put another one back in. 16 to 24 hours later. Yeah, that's that sounds easy. But that's sort of the most surgical surgery is a transplant kind of thing. The most medical device is real-time biomonitoring with your glucose monitor. You can have an implanted analytical device. This isn't me. This isn't a one-stop shop, but it is just to at least start with an overview and then run from there. Pharmaceuticals, everybody knows what a pill is, so that's straightforward. But then behaviors, social supports, and Um, so, your food guide is a type of behavioral social support to make better food purchasing decisions for your diet. Going to the gym is a behavioral social support that is important for healthy, active lifestyle. So there's a lot here, and this is as shallow and as superficial as I could possibly make it, because general audiences are really fucking hard to address properly. And if anybody tells you otherwise, they're lying, pure and simple. So that's been the sort of the industrial look and history of sort of what is um, just the natural progression of everything, and where all this stuff came from and where it kind of goes. So if you're interested, like always, if you're interested, go look it up yourself. Okay? If anybody's in the chat and there's questions, there's always, there's always an answer. Anyway, that's it for now. A bientôt. Ciao. The Night Show has been sponsored by Innovative Potential and Classical Music.